Learning the building blocks of Chinese characters is a great idea, but what should you learn about each character component? And more specifically, should you learn the pronunciation of radicals? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about radicals, and more specifically, if you should learn the pronunciation of radicals. As an independent learner of Chinese, you have to keep three questions in mind: what to learn, how to learn it, and how much time to spend on each area. I think that the first one, what you learn, is the most important question, because you don't want to miss out on essential things, and you don't want to waste time on things you could equally well have skipped. And if you can identify things you can skip, well, the other questions are not even relevant, because you've decided to not learn it anyway. But the problem is, how do you know which is which? For example, should you learn how the radicals are pronounced? Is that something essential? Is it something you can skip entirely? Or does it lie somewhere in between, perhaps? This is what I will discuss in this episode, but before I can answer that question, there is another question I need to answer first, and that is, what is a radical, what is a character component, and is there a difference between these two? Does it matter? And because I'm bringing it up here, I can tell you in advance that it does matter, and we do need to sort this out before I answer the actual question. What we choose to call something when we talk about learning Chinese characters in English does not, of course, influence the thing described. Characters are the way they are, regardless of how I describe them in this episode. But in order to interpret my advice in the correct way and to be able to apply it in your own learning, I think it is important to sort out what's what, which will also tell you a lot about how Chinese characters work. So let's do that. So we have two terms we need to sort out. The first is character component, and the second is radical. So a character component is basically a part of a compound, and thus you can say that a character like Hao, good, has two components, and that Xiang, to think, also has two components, although one of them is a compound in itself, so depending on how you define it, you could say it had three. Since the definition of what a character component is very broad, there is no definitive list of all character components, because sometimes it can depend on how you split a compound and so on. Each character component can have one or more functions in the compound. For example, it could provide the sound, or it could provide the meaning. In some cases, a single component does both, but in many cases the component has no function at all, meaning that historically it's usually something else or is a changed version of another character that is unrecognizable today, so it doesn't contribute either meaning or sound to the compound as a whole. If we look at a simple example, Hao, good, again, we can see that it has two components, Nü, woman, and Zi, child or son. Both these are semantic components and contribute meaning to the whole compound. If we take the other character I mentioned, Xiang, to think, we have at the top Xiang, appearance, which indicates the sound, and you can hear that it has the same initial, the same final, and just a different tone. And the bottom part, Xin, heart, indicates the meaning. If this is the first time you hear about this, I strongly suggest you check out my series, The Building Blocks of Chinese, which will take you on a journey through the Chinese writing system from the smallest components up to compound words. So to summarize, character component is a very broad term that simply means a part of a Chinese character, usually one part in a compound. Then we have the word radical, which does not mean the same thing as character component, but is often used incorrectly to refer to character components in general. I mentioned that components have specific functions, and the radical then can be said to be a character component that has a very, very specific function, namely to index that character in a dictionary to make it easier to find. This means that radical is a role that a specific component has in a character. It also means that each character only has one radical, because the point is to make them easier to look up. I mean, before the days of digital dictionaries, you had no choice. You had to arrange everything in some way, and doing so by radical was the best method that people could come up with. If there were more than one radical per character, you wouldn't know which of these it was sorted by, and it would be impossible to find it in a dictionary. There are several different lists of radicals that have been used throughout history and in different regions, but the currently most widely used one is called the Kangxi radicals, and it consists of 214 character components. So based on what I said earlier about a radical being a specific role a certain component has in a certain compound, we can then know that these 214 components, they are not the radicals in all characters they appear in. So a component being on this list simply means that there are characters where that component is the radical. It does not mean that in any character this component appears, that is the radical. I know this is pretty abstract, so let's look at a few examples. And if you want to look at the characters, you can follow along in the written article on Hacking Chinese, but I will make sure to pick characters that are as easy as possible so we can talk about them even if you can't see them. We're going to look at 3 characters. So the first one is zhi, as in 知道, to know, and it contains 2 functional components. On the left we have shi, which means arrow, and on the right we have kou, which means mouth. The first component, shi, gives the sound here. It has a similar initial, it has the same final, but it has a different tone. And if you're wondering why the pronunciation of the compound is not identical to the pronunciation of the phonetic component here, it's simply because these characters were created a long time ago and the spoken language has evolved a lot since then, while the characters have evolved much less, and sometimes in different directions. The second component, mouth, gives the meaning here, and presumably knowledge is transmitted by speaking, which is of course associated with the mouth. Moving on to number 2, we have kou, which means to fasten, and it also consists of 2 functional components. We have a variant of shou, hand, on the left, and then we have kou again, mouth, on the right. It's not surprising that the left part here is a semantic component related to the meaning of the character, because a hand is obviously clearly related to the action of fastening something. And it's not hard to see that the right component is a phonetic component, because kou and kou differ only in tone. Our final example is he, and it also has 2 components. We have he, which means grain, and kou again, which means mouth. Again, it's pretty easy to see which is the phonetic component here. He is pronounced exactly as the compound, so that is indeed the phonetic component, and kou is a semantic component related to the meaning, which is maybe less obvious, but it helps to know that this character originally meant to mediate, and that this is, of course, a verbal activity. So now we have these 3 characters, zhi, kou, and he. Can you guess which component in each of those 3 characters is the radical? The answer is no, you can't, and if you got it right, it meant that you weren't guessing, it meant that you knew it in advance because you had learned it somewhere. Remember that radicals have nothing to do with the functions of the components and how they contribute meaning and sound to the compound, and that the idea and system of using radicals to sort characters was invented long after the characters themselves were created. This means that they can't really explain anything about why this character looks the way it does. It's simply a convenient tool to sort them. Let's have a look at the answers, and if you didn't know the answers here, it doesn't matter. This is a good example of something you can ignore completely, because when you use a digital dictionary, you don't need this. So in zhi, to know, the radical is shi, the phonetic component on the left. In the second character, kou, to fasten, the radical is shou, a semantic component also on the left. And in he, and, the radical is kou, a semantic component on the right. It is true that in left-right compositions, such as these 3 characters, the radical is often on the left and it's often a semantic component, but as I've just illustrated, this is not always the case and you can't know this without actually looking it up in a dictionary. So to summarize, the whole concept of a radical is not very helpful unless you're interested in paper dictionaries, which, as we all know, is not strictly necessary or indeed even recommended in a modern society where we have access to electronic dictionaries instead. So why are we still talking about radicals? Why am I talking about radicals? In fact, one of the most popular articles on Hacking Chinese is called Kickstart Your Chinese Character Learning with the 100 Most Common Radicals. It is not called Kickstart Your Chinese Character Learning with the 100 Most Common Character Components. The reason is quite practical. My goal is to make Chinese easier to learn, and in order to reach that goal, I need to make sure that my articles and podcast episodes reach an audience. As I said earlier, most students, and even many teachers, use these terms incorrectly. When they say radical, they don't actually mean radical, they mean character component, or they conflate them in some way. and that means that most people who want to know about the building blocks of Chinese characters and so on, they do not search for, say, semantic or phonetic components. They search for radicals. That is not actually what they are looking for, but it is what they will type in a search engine, and it is what they will ask me verbally if they encounter me and want to know about learning Chinese characters. The desire to break Chinese characters down into smaller components and see how those fit together to form compounds is great to have, but if you then use the incorrect terms and you therefore don't find my articles, I have kind of failed and I will not reach the audience that I'm targeting. I should mention that even if I use a radical in the title, I do explain the difference between radical and character component and what I actually mean in the article itself. I should also mention that in the article with the most common 100 radicals, I do only list characters that can be radicals in different characters, and this is because these are often also semantic components, as I said earlier. It doesn't necessarily mean that those 100 are the most common ones and that there are no other components that are also important, but those 100 really are important and they can serve as radicals in different compounds. So a different way of saying that is that some radicals can be useful to learn, not because they are radicals, but because they also happen to have other functions in characters they appear in. This brings us to a point where I think we can answer the question posed in the title of this episode: should you learn the pronunciation of radicals? I think it should be clear by now why I spent 10 minutes talking about what a radical is and what it isn't, and if you followed this discussion and understood it, I think you already know the answer to this question. If you use the word radical correctly when asking the question, the answer is no, you do not need to learn the pronunciation of radicals, just like the answer to the question if you should learn radicals in general is also no. However, as mentioned, there might be other reasons to learn it anyway. For example, we saw that learning radicals can be useful not because they are radicals, but because they also happen to often be semantic components, and those are useful to learn. So what about the pronunciation of radicals? Is that as useful? The answer is no, and that is related to what I just said, because most of the radicals are often, not always, but often, the semantic component in a compound, and that means that it is often unrelated to the pronunciation, which means that learning the pronunciation of the radicals is much less useful than learning the meaning of the radicals. We could say then that the value of learning the pronunciation of radicals is related to how often it provides information about the pronunciation of the compounds in which these components appear. And like I said, this is quite rare. We did see an example of that earlier though, in the character zhi, as in to know. We saw that the shi, the arrow on the left, is the phonetic component and it's also the radical. But like I said, this is the exception, not the rule. If you look at a list of radicals, such as the 100 most common ones that I used in my article, you might notice that they have strange pronunciation sometimes. Or if you're a beginner, you might not notice this, but if you ask many native speakers how these characters are read, they simply don't know. For example, if we take the bottom part of a character like zhe, this, the one that means way or someone walking down a road, how is that pronounced? What about the top part of an, as in peaceful or quiet? How is that component pronounced? And finally, what about the left part of the character hen, which means very or quite, the one that looks like a person with an extra stroke over it? How is that pronounced? If you ask native speakers about this, they typically don't know, and this is a good indication that you definitely don't need to learn the pronunciation of these radicals. The reason often is that these radicals are never used as phonetic components, and so their pronunciation doesn't relate at all to the pronunciation of a compound, of a real character that's used in the language, and therefore it's completely useless to learn. Naturally, this is not true for all the radicals, because many radicals are standalone characters in themselves. For example, zhen, person, or ho, fire, or shan, mountain, they are all standalone common characters, and naturally you need to know how those are pronounced. But this is not because they are radicals, it's because they are also common characters. Again, this is something you don't know as a beginner, so to help you in that 100 common radicals list, I have added brackets to the pronunciation of the radicals that you can safely ignore. Now, I said that native speakers usually don't know the pronunciation of these radicals, but that doesn't mean that they can't talk about them. It's just that when they do, they use colloquial names for these specific components. And that can be very useful to know if you want to talk about writing characters or how characters are composed in Chinese with native speakers. So if we wanted to talk about the character components I mentioned earlier, so the first one was the bottom of 这, this, which means walking down a road, is usually called 走之旁, but the pronunciation of the character itself is 绰, and this then is not used by native speakers, and if you say this, few people will know what you mean. So just say 走之旁if you want to refer to this component in speaking. Next, we had the top part of 安, peaceful, and that one is read 眠, which nobody says. Instead, people just call it 宝盖头. And then finally, the third example, the left part of 很, is pronounced 赤, which few people know, and instead people just call it 双人旁. Knowing the colloquial names of these character components is not necessary, but if you want to talk about Chinese characters with native speakers, it can be rather useful. And you probably know some of them already. Maybe you know that the 3 dots on the left, when they represent water, are called 三点水. And that when we have a person on the left, it's called 单人旁, as opposed to the 双人旁we talked about earlier. If you want to learn the colloquial names of the radicals, I have included those in the 100 most common radical list, so you can study them there. So to summarize, whether or not you should learn the pronunciation of radicals depend on what you mean by radicals. But the general answer is that if you look at the components that appear on a list of radicals, many of them have pronunciations that are completely useless to learn. Naturally, some of them appear as standalone characters, and then you need to learn the pronunciation, but that's not because they are the radicals. And sometimes there are radicals that are also used as phonetic components, so when you encounter them in compounds where they give the sound, it might make sense to study and learn the pronunciation as well. Finally, we also talked about what to call these components or radicals in spoken Chinese. I mean, if we don't use their pronunciation, what do we do instead? And then we use these colloquial names that you can also learn if you want to. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.